Which clever cooking tricks could you only learn in home economics class? The ones that made thrift and skill second nature. In the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, these tricks stretched every dollar and kept families fed. How did we let those lessons disappear? How to make white sauce from scratch was one of the first lessons in home economics class because it was the base of so many other dishes. A little butter, a little flour, and a careful hand with the milk could turn into something that tied together casseroles, vegetables, or even gravies. Grandmothers may have learned it at home, but in the classroom, it was treated as a skill every student needed. If you could make a white sauce, you could dress up leftovers or stretch out a small amount of meat with creamed vegetables. Teachers drilled in the importance of stirring constantly, never letting lumps form, and seasoning at the end for flavor. It seemed simple, yet it was the foundation for dozens of meals that otherwise would have been plain. Students left class knowing they could create something smooth and creamy out of the bare minimum. It was clever, thrifty, and practical, which was the entire point of home economics. The secret of fluffy biscuits was another cherished teaching moment. Students learned that the way you cut the shortening into the flour decided if the biscuits would rise high and soft or fall flat and heavy. Rolling too much made them tough, while leaving the dough just shaggy gave them a tall lift in the oven. Teachers would gather the class around and show how to press the pastry cutter or two knives together until the flour looked like small pebbles. Then came the gentle fold of milk and kneading only once or twice before cutting. It was a matter of touch, not just following a recipe. The pride of seeing biscuits rise golden in the school ovens left a memory many never forgot. These were not store-bought rolls. They were warm, homemade proof of skill. Biscuits at dinner were not just bread. They were a sign that you had mastered something worth sharing. Stretching ground beef with oats or crackers was a trick every student remembered because it turned 1 pound of meat into a dish that could feed a whole family. In the home economics classroom, meatloaf was often the example, but the lesson applied to hamburgers or casseroles as well. Students were taught to mix rolled oats or crushed saltine crackers with the beef, letting the starch soak up juices and hold everything together. It was not just thrift, it was clever cooking that made food taste hearty even when meat was expensive. For many families during the 1960s or 1970s, this trick meant the difference between 2 servings and 6. Seasonings like onions or ketchup added flavor, but the bulk came from those fillers. Teachers stressed that nothing was wasted and that cooking was as much about economy as taste. Graduates of those classes never forgot how a little stretch could go a long way when it came to feeding hungry mouths. Boiling pasta without sticking may sound too obvious to teach, but in home economics class it was a point of pride. Teachers explained that pasta needed plenty of boiling water, a pinch of salt, and careful timing so that noodles did not clump together. A wooden spoon kept things moving, but so did the practice of stirring once in a while. Students discovered that rinsing was not always necessary, and that oil was never the trick that commercials made it seem. It was knowledge passed down like a family secret, but with the authority of the classroom. When pasta came out tender but not mushy, students realized they had control over something that had once seemed finicky. The lesson was not only about noodles but about confidence in boiling, draining, and timing. It was clever in its simplicity, and it made pasta dinners feel just a little more special when the whole pot came out perfect. Turning leftover bread into bread pudding was a sweet reward for paying attention. Home economics teachers showed how cubes of stale bread could be whisked with eggs, sugar, milk, and spices to create something warm and comforting. Students realized that nothing in the kitchen had to go to waste if you knew the right trick. This pudding became a lesson in thrift as well as dessert, proving that even the oldest loaf had value. The mixture baked into something golden, soft, and fragrant, filling the classroom with the smell of cinnamon or nutmeg. It was dessert without extravagance, made from scraps and a little imagination. The point was not only flavor, but also resourcefulness, a reminder that clever cooks could turn yesterday's leftovers into today's highlight. Many students remembered the first spoonful as proof that food did not need to be expensive to feel like a treat. That was the lasting charm of bread pudding in the classroom. Cooking vegetables without losing color was a trick that showed science in action. Green beans or broccoli were often used, and teachers explained that blanching in salted boiling water for just a few minutes kept vegetables bright instead of dull. Students were taught to shock them quickly in cold water afterward, locking in both color and crispness. It was a small step, but it turned something ordinary into something worth serving proudly. A plate of vivid green beans looked far more appetizing than limp gray ones. The lesson was that presentation mattered as much as flavor, and that nutrition could be preserved with a little care. It made students see vegetables differently, not as an afterthought, but as something beautiful on the plate. Families back home often saw a difference when those lessons carried over into dinner. Home economics turned vegetables into proof of skill, rather than just boiled side dishes. How to make perfect hard-boiled eggs became a rite of passage in many home economics classes. The trick was all in timing and cooling. Teachers explained that placing eggs gently into simmering water, not a rolling boil, prevented cracking and overcooking. 10 minutes of gentle simmering followed by a plunge into ice water kept yolks bright yellow rather than gray. Students practiced peeling shells without tearing the whites, a detail that mattered when serving salads or snacks. It was one of those small skills that built confidence quickly. Eggs were cheap, versatile, and always available, making them the perfect classroom ingredient. The satisfaction of slicing into a neat, sunny yolk stuck with students long after. The point was not luxury, but mastery, showing that even the simplest food could be handled with care and precision. Hard-boiled eggs became more than breakfast. They became a symbol of patience and practice in the kitchen. Reusing bacon grease in place of butter was a thrifty habit that teachers made into a full lesson. Students learned that saving drippings in jars gave them flavorful fat to use later for frying eggs, baking cornbread, or seasoning vegetables. It was a way of carrying taste from one meal into the next. Instead of throwing away what seemed like scraps, the grease became a kitchen staple. Teachers emphasized that this was not wasteful, but clever and practical. Many families had done the same for generations, and home economics simply gave it structure. Students saw firsthand how bacon grease added a depth that butter alone could not give. It was old-fashioned thrift wrapped up in everyday flavor, and it stuck with many long after. The jar of grease by the stove became a reminder of how simple tricks made the kitchen more efficient and flavorful at the same time. The trick to tenderizing cheaper meat cuts was one of the most practical lessons. Students learned that marinating in vinegar, tomato juice, or even buttermilk broke down the toughness and made meat taste better without extra cost. Teachers demonstrated with flank steak or round cuts, showing how acid worked over time. It was a revelation for teenagers who had only known expensive roasts or fried chicken. Suddenly, a tough, chewy cut became tender enough for a family dinner. Seasonings and patience were part of the lesson, but the real skill was in knowing how to make the most of what you had. The savings were obvious, but so was the satisfaction of learning a professional trick in a school kitchen. It proved that good meals did not depend on money, but on knowledge. This was clever cooking at its best, and students carried it with them long after. Using cornstarch to thicken sauces was a final essential trick. Teachers showed students how to mix cornstarch with cold water to create a slurry, whisking it into simmering liquid until it thickened. The technique seemed magical, transforming thin broths into glossy gravies or sauces in seconds. It was an emergency fix that saved dinners when flour lumps ruined the base. Students quickly realized that a teaspoon of cornstarch could rescue a watery stew or elevate a stir-fry. It was science and cooking blended together, giving results that felt instant. The classroom often erupted with pride when sauces turned silky right before their eyes. This trick was practical, thrifty, and endlessly useful in everyday cooking. It gave students confidence to experiment, knowing they had a way to recover from mistakes. Home economics was full of little miracles like this, and cornstarch thickening was one that never lost its charm. Whipping egg whites into peaks was a test of skill that home economics teachers loved to assign. Students learned that eggs needed to be room temperature and the bowl perfectly clean, or the whites would never rise. With a steady hand on the whisk or mixer, Clear liquid slowly transformed into soft mounds and then stiff peaks that held their shape. It was part science, part patience, and it felt like magic to watch. Teachers demonstrated folding sugar in gently so the air was not lost, creating the base for meringues or angel food cakes. Soufflés were often mentioned as the glamorous example, though few students actually made one. The bigger lesson was understanding how simple ingredients could change form with the right care. Many remembered the pride of turning something fragile into a dessert centerpiece. It was not just about sweetness, it was about learning control and precision in the kitchen. Home economics turned eggs into proof of mastery. Making Jell-O salad hold its shape was a practical challenge in classrooms during the 1960s and 1970s when molded salads filled tables at picnics and church suppers. Teachers explained that fruit had to be folded in only after the gelatin partially set. Otherwise, the pieces would sink or the mixture would collapse. Students stirred gently, careful not to break the wobble that was part of the charm. Cream or whipped topping could be added, but it had to be folded just so to stay fluffy. The whole process taught patience and timing, as well as a bit of presentation. Jell-O molds seemed simple, yet they were a test of planning and skill. Students who managed to unmold a perfect salad onto a plate felt like they had achieved something worth applause. At home, these salads became colorful highlights on tables filled with casseroles and meatloaf. It was a clever trick to make ordinary gelatin into a dish that drew attention. Freezing herbs in ice cubes was one of the preservation tips that showed how clever home economics teachers really were. Students were taught to chop parsley, mint, or chives, tuck them into ice trays, and pour water over them before freezing. Weeks later, the cubes could be popped out and dropped into soups, stews, or sauces for instant flavor. It was a way to make herbs last before freezer bags and gadgets made the job easy. For families with gardens, it meant no harvest went to waste. The lesson also showed how freezing locked in freshness and saved money. Students loved the idea because it felt like discovering a secret trick that even adults did not always know. This was not just about saving herbs. It was about learning to think ahead and make use of small resources. Home economics turned something that might wilt in days into something that could brighten meals for months. Cooking rice without burning was an important lesson because many families struggled with pots that stuck or scorched. Teachers insisted on the method of simmering. Measure water, add rice, cover tightly, and never stir until it was done. Students had to resist the urge to peek or fuss with the pot, since that released steam and ruined the texture. After resting, the rice was fluffed gently with a fork to separate the grains. This simple process transformed rice from a sticky mess into a side dish that felt polished and reliable. It became clear that technique mattered as much as ingredients. Families at home benefited from bowls of rice that no longer tasted charred or clumped. For many students, it was the first time rice came out right every time. That small success built confidence, showing that even tricky basics could be mastered with practice and patience. Home economics gave rice a new reputation for consistency. Making mayonnaise by hand was a test of endurance and technique in home economics classrooms. Students learned to whisk egg yolks while slowly adding oil, drop by drop, until the mixture thickened into creamy emulsion. Too fast and it would separate, too slow and it would feel endless. Teachers explained that patience was the real ingredient, along with a steady wrist. Vinegar, lemon juice, and mustard could be added for flavor, but the lesson was about control. It was not only mayonnaise they were making, it was the skill of turning simple parts into something unified. Most students found it exhausting, yet rewarding once the thick spread finally appeared in the bowl. The pride of spreading homemade mayonnaise on bread after such effort was unforgettable. While jars from the store eventually replaced the habit, students remembered the cleverness of knowing it could be made from scratch if needed. It was both practical and empowering. How to avoid lumpy gravy was one of those everyday lifesavers taught early in home economics class. Students were shown how to whisk flour into fat first, creating a smooth paste before adding liquid. This simple step, called making a roux, prevented clumps from forming and gave gravy a silky texture. Teachers emphasized steady stirring, never letting the mixture sit still long enough to scorch. Broth, milk, or pan drippings were added slowly, transforming into sauce right before their eyes. Many remembered the excitement of watching a watery mixture thicken perfectly. Gravy was important because it turned plain potatoes or meat into something satisfying. Families relied on it as a way to stretch flavor across the whole plate. Avoiding lumps may have seemed small, but it was proof that skill mattered more than luck in the kitchen. For many, this trick became one they used for the rest of their lives. Quick pickling cucumbers was a fun project that students loved because the results came so quickly. Teachers demonstrated how vinegar, sugar, and salt could transform slices into crisp pickles in just hours. Garlic, dill, or peppercorns could be added for variety, making the jars look as appealing as they tasted. This was not the long process of canning, but a quick trick that taught the basics of preservation. Students enjoyed tasting their pickles the next day, marveling at the flavor that seemed too strong for such a short time. Families at home welcomed jars of refrigerator pickles that added crunch to sandwiches or dinners. The lesson showed that not all preservation needed special equipment, just resourcefulness and a willingness to experiment. It captured the spirit of home economics perfectly. Simple ingredients, clever methods, and satisfying results. Pickling cucumbers this way turned an ordinary vegetable into something bright and refreshing without much effort at all. Reviving stale bread with steam was one of those tricks that felt like a small miracle. Teachers showed students how to wrap a stale loaf in a damp towel and place it in a warm oven. Minutes later, the crust softened, and the bread tasted fresh again. This was important in an era when nothing was thrown away lightly. Families often relied on bread for every meal, so wasting a loaf was unthinkable. Students realized that even something considered ruined could be saved with a clever method. It was thrift in action, but it was also comfort, because fresh bread made meals feel complete. At home, this trick often impressed parents who had resigned themselves to stale slices. The aroma of reheated bread filled classrooms, reminding everyone how powerful simple fixes could be. It was a lesson that showed food was never truly lost if you knew how to bring it back. The proper way to cream butter and sugar was the foundation for nearly every cake and cookie taught in home economics. Teachers explained that beating the two together created air pockets, making baked goods light instead of dense. Students practiced with wooden spoons or mixers, learning that patience and thoroughness were essential. It was not glamorous work, but it was transformative once cakes rose fluffy or cookies spread just right. The sound of spoons scraping bowls became part of the rhythm of the classroom. Recipes that had once turned out heavy suddenly tasted bakery-worthy. Teachers reminded students that this one step determined the success of countless desserts. Families at home noticed the difference too, when their children proudly presented cakes that actually matched the pictures. It was proof that technique could be more important than ingredients. Creaming butter and sugar became a lifelong skill that carried into kitchens well beyond school. How to stretch milk with powdered milk was a lesson in thrift that many households quietly appreciated. Teachers instructed students to mix powdered milk with fresh, creating more without losing flavor. This stretched supplies during tight times when buying more milk was not possible. For children who drank glasses daily, it meant nothing changed on the table. In cooking, it gave sauces and puddings the same creaminess without extra cost. Students discovered that careful blending made the difference, since lumpy powdered milk gave the trick away. Once mastered, it became nearly impossible to notice. Families valued the savings, while students gained respect for how creativity solved problems in the kitchen. It was not just about milk. It was about making more out of less. This simple trick carried the spirit of home economics, where thrift and skill came together. It was a reminder that even shortages could be overcome with clever thinking. Cooking corn in the husk was one of those lessons that made students realize the simplest tricks could deliver the best results. Teachers explained that leaving the husks on and tossing ears straight into the oven or onto glowing coals protected the kernels while steaming them inside their natural wrapper. When peeled back, the corn came out smoky, tender, and full of flavor, without butter or seasoning. The aroma of roasted husks filled classrooms and lingered in memories long after. Students learned that the husks kept moisture in, prevented burning, and saved time on cleanup. It was efficient, thrifty, and delicious, all in one. This trick carried well into picnics and backyard barbecues, where a pile of corn roasted in coals felt festive and rustic at once. For many students, it was the first time they realized how cooking could feel like magic, without fancy tools or expensive ingredients. Home economics showed that nature had already designed the perfect cooking vessel, and all it took was a little heat and trust in the process. It was one clever secret everyone was proud to carry home. Making salad dressing from pantry staples was a core skill passed down in nearly every home economics class. Bottled dressing might have been convenient, but teachers insisted that students learn how to whisk oil, vinegar, mustard, and seasoning into something far fresher. The exercise taught ratios, technique, and the importance of balance between fat and acid. A pinch of sugar or herbs could tilt the flavor, and suddenly, a plain bowl of lettuce transformed into something worth eating. Students took pride in creating a creamy vinaigrette or tangy French dressing with their own hands. Families at home quickly noticed when their children dressed salads with something new, something that tasted sharper and brighter than the bottled varieties. It was inexpensive and practical, a lesson that good food did not need to come from a store shelf. Beyond flavor, it showed that independence in the kitchen came from small skills built piece by piece. Students walked away with confidence, knowing they could turn the simplest pantry staples into a polished dish. Home economics elevated salad dressing from an afterthought into a point of pride. Preventing fruit pies from soggy bottoms was a lesson in both science and thrift because nobody wanted to see wasted effort on a mushy crust. Teachers taught students to sprinkle flour, breadcrumbs, or cornstarch into the bottom crust before adding fruit. These simple barriers absorbed juices as the pie baked, leaving the pastry crisp instead of limp. Students learned the importance of thickening agents, how cornstarch set up firmer fillings, and how flour balanced moisture. It was more than keeping pies pretty. It was about ensuring dessert slices held their shape on plates. In many homes, pie was the centerpiece of gatherings, so a perfect slice mattered for both taste and pride. Students who mastered the trick felt like bakers with real skill. Families back home were quick to notice when a pie finally came out neat and picture-worthy, without sogginess spoiling the presentation. This clever little step was one of the secrets that turned ordinary bakers into confident ones. Home economics gave pies dignity, ensuring they looked as good as they tasted. It proved even desserts could be both thrifty and polished. How to clarify soup broth was one of those seemingly small lessons that showed students the difference between plain cooking and refined cooking. Teachers explained that skimming foam during simmering and straining through cloth or fine sieves kept broth clear, golden, and appetizing. It was not about changing flavor, but about presentation and pride. A clear broth looked cleaner, more professional, and carried a sense of care. Students learned patience, hovering near pots and skimming off impurities with spoons, a practice that required focus. Some teachers even demonstrated the egg white trick, where beaten whites were stirred in to attract particles before straining. Families appreciated broths that looked as beautiful as they tasted, especially during holidays or when guests were expected. Clear soups were once a mark of skill, and students who learned the process felt they had taken a step closer to real cooking mastery. It was a reminder that home economics was not just about feeding a family, but about doing so with thoughtfulness and care. A bowl of clarified broth became a symbol of effort done right. Using newspaper for ripening tomatoes was a clever, no-cost trick that every class seemed to share at some point. Teachers explained that wrapping green tomatoes in sheets of newspaper and leaving them in a box or drawer sped ripening without special equipment. The fruit produced natural gases that, trapped in the paper, encouraged the process. Students were amazed to find hard green tomatoes turn red and juicy after just days. It was a simple, practical lesson in both food science and thrift. Families often used the trick at home too, especially when gardens produced more than could be eaten at once. It meant no tomatoes were wasted, and salads or sauces could be made weeks after harvest. In homes where every bit of produce mattered, this knowledge was valuable. Students remembered it not just as a classroom lesson, but as a skill that carried over into real life. Home economics proved that even yesterday's newspaper could stretch today's food supply. It was the kind of small, clever trick that left a lasting mark. How to knead yeast dough correctly was one of the most hands-on lessons in any home economics class. Students were shown how to press, fold, and stretch dough with the heels of their hands until it became smooth and elastic. Teachers emphasized the feel of the dough as much as the look, explaining that proper kneading developed the gluten needed for bread to rise. At first, it was exhausting, arms sore from the rhythm of pushing and pulling. But then, the magic happened. Dough that was once sticky and rough transformed into a supple mass ready for proofing. When loaves came out of the oven golden and fragrant, students understood the value of the effort. It was not just about bread, but about learning patience and persistence. Families often marveled when students returned home with fresh rolls or loaves that tasted better than store-bought. Kneading taught resilience as much as skill, showing that good food came from steady work. It became one of the most memorable parts of home economics. Using leftover ham bones in soup was one of the thrifty lessons that showed how waste could be turned into days of meals. Teachers explained how bones, with bits of meat still clinging, flavored beans, split peas, or lentils into hearty dishes. Students watched as a pot transformed simple, inexpensive ingredients into something rich and filling. It was a lesson in thrift, nutrition, and patience all at once. The aroma of simmering beans flavored by ham bone carried a comfort that stayed with students long after class. Families often knew the trick already, but seeing it taught in school reinforced its value. For households with little to spare, nothing was wasted, not even bones. Students realized that flavor did not have to come from expensive cuts, but from knowing how to use what you had. Soups like these warmed homes, filled stomachs, and reminded everyone of resourcefulness. Home economics kept alive the art of stretching food until nothing remained. It was more than cooking, it was survival turned flavorful. Cooking potatoes in their skins was a simple yet important lesson that showed how much nutrition could be saved with one change. Teachers explained that peeling potatoes stripped away vitamins and fiber, while leaving skins on preserved them. Students learned to scrub potatoes well and boil or bake them whole. The result was tender flesh with added flavor from the skins. It also saved time in preparation and cut down on waste. Families at home often knew this trick, but in classrooms it became a formal part of nutrition lessons. Potatoes were a staple on nearly every table, so learning to cook them better made a real difference. Students realized that even small shifts in method improved both health and thrift. The lesson carried forward into mashed potatoes with skins, baked potatoes, or potato salads with more substance. Home economics gave everyday staples a healthier twist without extra cost. It was a reminder that wisdom often came in the simplest forms. Simple sugar syrup for fruit preservation was one of those skills that turned harvest into sweetness that lasted. Teachers taught students how to boil water and sugar together into syrup, then pour it over peaches, berries, or cherries sealed in jars. The syrup locked in flavor and color, keeping fruit edible for months. Students learned about sterilizing jars, sealing lids, and storing safely. For many, it was the first time they saw how summer could be saved in glass. Families loved having jars of preserved fruit ready in winter, when fresh produce was scarce. The process felt like magic, turning fragile fruit into something enduring. It was also practical, teaching thrift by preventing waste from gardens or markets. Beyond that, it carried a sense of tradition, since canning was once an essential household skill. Students gained not only a recipe, but a way to hold on to seasons. Home economics made sure this kind of preservation stayed alive a little longer. The rule of mise en place was never called fancy in home economics classrooms, but its importance was drilled into every student. Teachers encouraged gathering all ingredients, measuring them, and setting tools out before starting to cook. This simple act made recipes flow smoothly and reduced mistakes. students learned that organization in the kitchen was as important as creativity. Forgetting salt or losing track of butter mid-recipe often meant failure, so mise en place became a quiet but powerful rule. It was a skill that applied beyond cooking, teaching planning, and discipline in small, everyday ways. Families noticed when meals at home ran smoother because their children learned to prepare first. Though students did not know the French term, they practiced it every class without fail. Years later, many remembered that organization was the real foundation of good food. Home economics gave them structure as much as skill, and it showed in every dish that succeeded. Making a gravy base from beef drippings was one of the most practical and delicious habits Grandma swore by. After frying ground beef, she never just poured off the pan juices; they were too valuable to waste. Instead, she whisked in flour, maybe a splash of broth or milk, and built a flavorful gravy that could be ladled over mashed potatoes, bread, or noodles. This simple act turned a basic skillet of beef into a complete, comforting meal that stretched to feed more mouths. It gave dinners depth and warmth, making even small portions feel satisfying. Families relied on this trick not only because it saved money, but because it created flavor from what others might have discarded. The aroma of that sizzling gravy filled kitchens and promised a meal that was both hearty and resourceful. These days, we're often told to drain and discard fat for health reasons, but back then, every drop was an opportunity. That was the beauty of Grandma's cooking, knowing how to turn scraps into something rich, flavorful, and worth remembering long after the plates were cleared. The macaroni beef ring was more than just a recipe, it was a showpiece. You took cooked elbow macaroni and ground beef, mixed it with eggs and tomato sauce, and pressed the whole thing into a ring mold. After it baked and set, you flipped it onto a serving plate, and there it stood, a golden brown pasta wreath. But the real drama came next. The center of the ring was filled with creamed peas, buttered corn, or even leftover stew if that is what you had. It was the kind of dinner that turned heads at church potlucks or family dinners. Kids would laugh, adults would smile politely, and everyone would eat it anyway because it was surprisingly good. The pasta held together just enough to slice, and the beef gave it weight and flavor. Sometimes there was cheese mixed in, sometimes it was just seasoned with onion powder and salt. Either way, it was a clever use of pantry staples and leftover meat. Burying food underground for natural refrigeration was one of the quiet genius moves that let Native American families survive through blistering summers and brutal winters alike. It sounds almost too simple now, but when done right, it was remarkably effective. By digging deep, shaded pits and lining them with grass, bark, or even cool stones, they created natural refrigerators that could keep vegetables crisp, fruits fresh, and even meat safer than leaving it above ground. There was an art to it, a dance with the seasons and the soil that few today remember. But the wisdom of making the earth itself your storage partner never truly faded. And when long journeys or harsh winters loomed ahead, native chefs had another brilliant solution for keeping their people nourished on the move, mixing wild berries, nuts, and hidden energy into one of history's first real trail mixes. Burying food underground for natural refrigeration was one of the quiet genius moves that let Native American families survive through blistering summers and brutal winters alike. It sounds almost too simple now, but when done right, it was remarkably effective. By digging deep, shaded pits and lining them with grass, bark, or even cool stones, they created natural refrigerators that could keep vegetables crisp, fruits fresh, and even meat safer than leaving it above ground. There was an art to it, a dance with the seasons and the soil that few today remember. But the wisdom of making the earth itself your storage partner never truly faded. And when long journeys or harsh winters loomed ahead, native chefs had another brilliant solution for keeping their people nourished on the move, mixing wild berries, nuts, and hidden energy into one of history's first real trail mixes. Microwaving butter wrapped in parchment for even melting was a clever method shared in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to ensure butter melted smoothly without separating or overheating. This technique involved wrapping a stick or portion of butter in parchment paper before placing it in the microwave for short intervals. The parchment protected the butter from direct heat, allowing it to soften evenly and preventing the fats from separating, which often happened when butter was microwaved unwrapped. This method saved time compared to melting butter on the stove while maintaining ideal texture for baking or cooking. It was especially useful in mid-century kitchens where efficiency and precision were valued. By using parchment, home cooks avoided the mess and uneven results of traditional melting methods. This trick reflected the era's increasing use of microwaves and new kitchen materials to improve everyday cooking. It remains a handy tip for modern cooks seeking quick, reliable butter melting without sacrificing quality. Using potato water to thicken soups and stews naturally was a clever and economical way to avoid flour or cornstarch as thickening agents. When boiling potatoes, the starchy water left behind was often saved and added to soups or stews to create a velvety texture without needing extra ingredients. Betty Crocker's recipes encouraged this practice as a resourceful method during times when pantry staples were limited or expensive. The potato water provided a subtle richness and body, enhancing the mouthfeel of broths and reducing waste in the kitchen. This trick was especially important during the Depression and wartime rationing, when stretching ingredients was essential. It also allowed cooks to keep recipes simple and gluten-free before dietary restrictions became widely known. The use of potato water as a thickener brought a natural creaminess to dishes, transforming humble soups into hearty meals. Today, many have forgotten this straightforward technique, but it remains a valuable, zero-cost way to improve soups and stews with minimal effort. Adding grated carrots or zucchini into ground beef was a quiet, clever trick that served multiple purposes in Grandma's kitchen. It wasn't only about making the beef stretch further, though that was a big part of it. It was also about slipping in extra nutrition without anyone noticing. Carrots added a natural sweetness that balanced savory flavors, while zucchini added moisture that kept burgers, meatloaf, or casseroles from drying out. Grating the vegetables fine meant they disappeared right into the beef, and kids usually had no idea they were eating vegetables at all. In a time when every ingredient had to be used wisely, this method made sense because it extended protein portions and made meals healthier at the same time. It also gave the beef more body and volume, turning one meal into two without anyone feeling shortchanged. This trick carried a sense of care, because Grandma knew how to make meals nourishing as well as filling. Today, with rising costs and an emphasis on hidden veggies, this old idea feels surprisingly modern. It's a reminder that cleverness in cooking was never about fancy ingredients, but about small adjustments that turned the ordinary into something bigger and better than expected. Hungarian hamburger bake brought a little old-world flair to the weeknight dinner table. This casserole took seasoned ground beef and paired it with wide egg noodles, paprika, sour cream, and cheese. You would layer everything into a baking dish, then bake it until the noodles were tender and the sauce was bubbling and golden on top. It was creamy, smoky, and deeply satisfying. The paprika added warmth without being too spicy, and the sour cream gave it that signature tangy richness. It was not exactly authentic Hungarian cuisine, but it borrowed enough to make you feel like you were eating something a little exotic. The recipe was especially popular in Midwestern kitchens, where Eastern European immigrant traditions were still alive and well. It was the kind of dish that made you feel cultured without straying too far from your comfort zone. Most of the ingredients came from cans, boxes, or the fridge, nothing fancy or hard to find, and that was the whole point. The secret of grease preserves is one of those survival tricks that almost defies belief today. After cooking meat, Native American chefs would save every drop of rendered animal fat, pouring it carefully over shredded or chopped pieces of the meat inside clay pots or animal bladders. Once sealed, the fat hardened into a protective barrier that kept bacteria and air out, preserving the meat for weeks, even months. This was not just storage. It was insurance against famine, sickness, and scarcity. Meat preserved this way stayed rich, flavorful, and nutritious, providing vital energy when fresh food was impossible to find. Every time someone dipped into a pot of grease preserves, they were eating a lesson in patience, gratitude, and survival. But even the best preserved meat needed help lasting through long journeys or seasons, and sometimes the land itself offered the perfect cold pantry, hidden just beneath your feet. The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Making buttermilk substitute with vinegar or lemon juice was a widely used shortcut in mid-century American kitchens when buttermilk was not always readily available or affordable. This simple trick involved adding 1 tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice to a cup of regular milk and letting it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes. The acid in the vinegar or lemon juice curdled the milk slightly, mimicking the tangy flavor and thicker consistency of buttermilk. This substitute worked well in recipes such as pancakes, biscuits, and cakes, where buttermilk's acidity was necessary to react with baking soda for leavening. Betty Crocker's cookbooks embraced this hack for its practicality, helping home cooks achieve consistent results without needing specialty ingredients. The trick saved time and money, reducing trips to the store and preventing spoiled buttermilk from going to waste. This approach reflected the resourcefulness encouraged in the post-war era, where adaptability in the kitchen was valued. It remains a trusted method today for anyone needing a quick buttermilk replacement. Preserving herbs in oil for longer freshness was a smart pantry trick, cherished in vintage kitchens to keep garden herbs usable well beyond their natural shelf life. Instead of letting herbs wilt or dry out quickly, home cooks would finely chop fresh herbs like parsley, thyme, or rosemary and pack them tightly into clean glass jars. Then they would cover the herbs completely with olive oil or vegetable oil, sealing the jar tightly to prevent air exposure. This method created a flavorful, herb-infused oil that could be used in cooking or as a finishing touch for dishes. Not only did this technique extend the herbs' usability through winter months, but it also captured their fresh flavors in a convenient form. This old-fashioned preservation trick was especially valuable before modern freezing and refrigeration methods were widespread. It allowed families to enjoy the taste of summer herbs year-round without the cost or waste of constantly buying fresh produce. Rediscovering this method today offers a delicious way to add fresh herb flavor to everyday meals with a touch of nostalgic practicality. Cooking with onion soup mix was one of those mid-century hacks that made its way into countless beef recipes, and for good reason. The packets were cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with onion flavor that instantly transformed ground beef. Grandma would sprinkle it into meatloaf, burgers, or casseroles, and suddenly the dish tasted like it had been seasoned all day. The dried onion flakes added texture, while the seasoning mix brought a savory depth that was hard to achieve with just salt and pepper. For busy households, it was a shortcut that never felt like cheating, because the results were always so satisfying. Families grew used to the rich flavor it gave their meals, and the convenience meant it became a pantry staple in many homes. Today, with so many seasoning blends on the shelves, onion soup mix feels almost quaint, but it was once revolutionary in its simplicity. It proved that with a single packet, a plain pound of beef could be turned into something memorable. This trick was less about being fancy and more about being clever, and that's exactly why it became one of Grandma's sworn-by secrets. Salisbury steak casserole was the homemade version of a frozen food legend. Instead of pulling a silver tray from the oven, families made their own from scratch, and honestly, it was usually better. This version called for seasoned ground beef shaped into thick oval patties, then baked in a mushroom and onion gravy. It was rich, saucy, and had that stick-to-your-ribs kind of feel. If you were lucky, someone would sprinkle crispy fried onions on top during the last few minutes in the oven, adding that perfect crunch to an already comforting dish. It was not a fancy meal, but it felt like something special. Some people added Worcestershire sauce or a splash of soy for extra umami, but most just used canned soup and a good hand with salt and pepper. You would serve it with mashed potatoes, egg noodles, or a slice of white bread to sop up all that gravy. Kids loved it because it tasted like fast food. Adults loved it because it was hearty and cheap. Roasting root vegetables directly in campfire coals was one of the simplest yet most powerful cooking methods passed down through generations. Without ovens, pots, or fancy tools, native cooks understood that the earth's hidden foods, things like carrots, turnips, onions, and yams, could be transformed into sweet, hearty meals with nothing more than time and fire. Raw roots were buried in the hot, glowing coals of a dying fire, slowly roasting under layers of ash and heat. As they baked, their natural sugars caramelized, their fibers softened, and what once was hard and bitter became soft, rich, and deeply satisfying. Pulling a roasted root from the coals was like uncovering buried treasure, the skin blackened and crisp, the inside steaming and tender. And speaking of patience, some of the sweetest flavors ever created by native chefs required even longer waits, like gathering and boiling maple sap into a clear, nourishing water that tasted like spring itself. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. Adding a pinch of salt to sweet pie fillings was a subtle seasoning tip that Betty Crocker's cookbook shared to balance and brighten dessert flavors. While salt is often associated with savory dishes, its inclusion in fruit or custard fillings enhanced the overall taste by cutting through sweetness and amplifying natural flavors. This small amount of salt helped prevent the dessert from tasting overly sugary or one-dimensional. It was especially effective in pies featuring apples, berries, or pumpkins, where a touch of salt brought out depth and complexity. The trick encouraged home bakers to think beyond basic sweetness and embrace flavor layering. This technique reflected mid-century culinary wisdom that even simple ingredients could be used strategically to improve results. Adding salt to sweet fillings became a hallmark of thoughtful dessert preparation, elevating humble pies to memorable treats. The tip remains a valuable lesson for modern cooks seeking balanced and nuanced sweets. Making fluffy mashed potatoes by adding hot milk gradually was a classic technique to avoid gluey or heavy mashed potatoes. Betty Crocker emphasized warming the milk before mixing it slowly into cooked potatoes, which helped the starches absorb liquid evenly and created a smooth, light texture. Cold milk shocked the potatoes and caused them to seize up, resulting in a dense and sticky mash. This technique was especially important when potatoes were a staple food and needed to be prepared just right to satisfy hungry families. The gradual addition allowed for better control over consistency and avoided watery or overly stiff results. While simple, it was a mark of good home cooking skill in mid-century kitchens. Rediscovering this trick can turn ordinary mashed potatoes into a creamy delight worthy of any dinner table. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely. And tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With 1 can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic, but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Sloppy Joe pie was what you made when a sandwich was not quite enough. The sweet, tangy beef, made with ketchup, mustard, and maybe brown sugar, got spooned into a dish and topped with biscuit dough or pie crust. Then it baked until golden and bubbly. It smelled like school lunches and weekday nights. The filling was classic Sloppy Joe, but the crust gave it shape. You could eat it with a fork. You could add cheese. Some families topped it with cornbread or mashed potatoes instead. It was a recipe that adapted to whatever was in the kitchen. What never changed was how satisfying it felt. 1 pan, 1 meal, 1 good reason to sit down and eat. It was often made after a sandwich dinner when the meat outlasted the buns. Sloppy Joe pie made the most of what was left and still gave you something to look forward to. It was humble, but proud, made for people who did not ask for much, just something warm and maybe a little sweet. Trapping natural wild yeasts for bread making was a delicate dance between patience, instinct, and trust in nature. Long before modern yeast packets made baking effortless, native chefs understood how to harness the living cultures floating invisibly all around them. They would leave simple mixtures of ground corn, acorn flour, or other grains mixed with water exposed to the open air, letting wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria settle into the mix over several days. Every loaf was alive, shaped by the air, the season, and the land itself. Each region had its own distinct flavors, a fingerprint left by invisible forces. It was slow, careful baking rooted in the rhythms of the world, not the ticking of a kitchen timer. And if you thought that was incredible, imagine making an entire soup without a pot, without a bowl, just heated rocks, fresh herbs, and the oldest cooking trick you have never heard of. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine, it was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters, through long hunting trips, and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Browning ground meat in small batches for better flavor was a technique Betty Crocker's cookbooks recommended to home cooks aiming for evenly cooked, richly flavored dishes. Cooking smaller amounts at a time allowed the meat to brown properly rather than steam, enhancing its taste and texture. This method prevented overcrowding the pan, which can cause the meat to release moisture and become soggy. The resulting browned meat developed a deeper color and more complex flavors, making it ideal for sauces, casseroles, and skillet meals. This cooking trick was valued in mid-century kitchens for producing superior results with common ingredients like ground beef or pork. Betty Crocker's detailed guidance on this technique reflected the growing culinary knowledge shared with home cooks to elevate everyday meals. Taking the extra time to brown meat in batches showed an investment in flavor that distinguished home-cooked dishes. This approach continues to be a fundamental principle for achieving delicious and well-textured meals. Creating mock mayonnaise with egg yolk and vinegar was a wartime-era hack that helped households cope when commercial mayonnaise was scarce or rationed. This clever substitute involved whisking egg yolks with vinegar, oil, and seasonings to mimic the creamy texture and tang of real mayonnaise. Betty Crocker's cookbooks offered this recipe as an affordable and easy alternative that required only basic pantry ingredients. The mock mayo kept salads, sandwiches, and dressings flavorful during tough economic times and supply shortages. It was particularly useful when fresh eggs and vinegar were more available than processed condiments. This homemade version might not have had the exact consistency of store-bought mayo, but it delivered the essential taste and moisture needed in classic recipes. Today, recreating this old-fashioned substitute can connect modern cooks to a resourceful culinary tradition that made simple ingredients stretch farther while keeping meals delicious and familiar. Mixing in stale bread soaked in milk was one of those Depression-era tricks that turned necessity into brilliance. Instead of wasting old bread, Grandma would soften the slices in milk until they were almost mush, then fold them straight into ground beef. This gave the meat extra volume and body, while the milk kept it tender and juicy. It was a way to bulk up meatloaf, burgers, and patties without making them dry or heavy, and no one at the table felt like they were eating less meat. The bread simply disappeared into the mixture, leaving behind a moist, flavorful dish that stretched further than a pound should. This practice also reflected a mindset where nothing went to waste and every scrap was valuable. Today we might see it as a quaint old trick, but back then it was survival and comfort in one. It made meals not only possible but memorable, because they were built out of creativity as much as ingredients. With this method, Grandma could take what might have been thrown away and transform it into something hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, a true testament to the resourcefulness of kitchens from that era. Shaping beef into steaks was one of those clever illusions that made dinners feel fancier than they really were. With a bit of seasoning and careful shaping, Grandma could take plain ground beef and press it into oval patties that looked like individual cuts of steak. Once browned in a skillet and topped with gravy or onions, they gave the impression of a hearty, steakhouse-style meal without the cost of real steak. For families who couldn't often afford higher cuts of meat, this trick was a way to enjoy the feeling of indulgence without breaking the budget. Kids grew up thinking they were eating something special, and in a way, they were. The special part was how much love and creativity went into making dinner stretch. The technique wasn't complicated, but it carried a sense of pride in serving meals that looked more extravagant than they were. Today, we call it Salisbury steak or hamburger steak, but the heart of it is the same, turning ground beef into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was resourcefulness wrapped in flavor, and it left memories stronger than the meat itself. Beef and barley bake was what happened when you wanted stew without the soup. You took ground beef, cooked it with onions, carrots, and sometimes celery, then stirred in pearl barley and baked the whole thing until thick, golden, and aromatic. It was a dish that felt old, like something from your grandmother's farmhouse kitchen. And maybe it was. Barley has been around longer than most grains, and during the 1960s and 1970s, it was one of those ingredients that made a quiet comeback thanks to its price and nutrition. This bake was earthy and dense, like a cross between stuffing and pot roast. You could season it with thyme or just keep it simple. It filled the house with the smell of comfort. It kept you full for hours, and it made even the cheapest cut of beef stretch a little farther. Sometimes you added a splash of tomato juice, sometimes just a pat of butter on top. It was a blank canvas, but a dependable one. You could make it ahead of time, freeze it, and reheat it without losing an ounce of flavor. It may not win beauty contests, but beef and barley bake always won dinner. Trapping natural wild yeasts for bread making was a delicate dance between patience, instinct, and trust in nature. Long before modern yeast packets made baking effortless, native chefs understood how to harness the living cultures floating invisibly all around them. They would leave simple mixtures of ground corn, acorn flour, or other grains mixed with water exposed to the open air, letting wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria settle into the mix over several days. Every loaf was alive, shaped by the air, the season, and the land itself. Each region had its own distinct flavors, a fingerprint left by invisible forces. It was slow, careful baking rooted in the rhythms of the world, not the ticking of a kitchen timer. And if you thought that was incredible, Imagine making an entire soup without a pot, without a bowl, just heated rocks, fresh herbs, and the oldest cooking trick you have never heard of. Drop your favorite kitchen hack in the comments, hit like if you ever flunked home ec, and subscribe so we can keep serving up tasty throwbacks.